So thank you all again for joining us today. Our session is titled Biometric ID, Complexities and Trajectories in Lebanon Social Assistance. We'll be discussing biometric IDs as well as the data collection infrastructures behind them that are implemented to deliver things such as welfare. For those unfamiliar with biometric IDs, it is the measurement of some form of biological marker. So examples of this include scanning your fingerprint or an iris scan or measuring your walking patterns. Biometrics are used to register, verify, authenticate, and identify refugee or welfare beneficiaries. And so it's become a very useful tool in social assistance and humanitarian aid as a way to cost effectively, efficiently, and more reliably identify potential and current recipients. And by data collection infrastructures, what we're referring to today is basically those systems very broadly that are used to transfer goods, ideas, data, people, power, and capital in order to engage in data collection, storage, and analysis. So examples of this include servers as well as interagency databases. So our presentations today are based on our research in Lebanon and throughout the region. And what we're going to do is suggest what data collection could look like in the future. And we'll also pose some questions about the complexities of digital rights in social assistance and data collection infrastructures in the Middle East. So one of our major predictions is that data centralization will not really ever happen in Lebanon due to political sectorial divisiveness as well as compartmentalization. And another prediction that we have is that data collection on vulnerable populations will continue to become more and more transnational and headed by these transnational organizations such as the UN and INGOs. What we're going to argue today and what we'd love to bring up in our discussion is that digital rights should not be conceived as secondary rights. Rather, they're actually fundamental to achieving these primary rights, such as the right to food, shelter, and safety. So we hope to open up a broader discussion about both the necessity and the challenges of digital rights in this space, especially in this current pandemic where data collection and technologies are ever more necessary to receive crucial forms of medical and social goods and services that many fundamentally rely on to live and navigate the region. So without further ado, Sacha, she will provide her first bit of amazing research.
Thanks, Jena. So today what I'll be presenting is research that was actually undertaken for a SMEX report called The Future of Biometrics and Digital ID in Lebanon, assessing proposed systems for elections and social assistance. This research was funded by Privacy International, and the project was actually conceived before October 2019, so before the protests began in Lebanon. Focusing on the use of biometric ID in elections after calls were made for biometric ID in elections in 2017, ahead of the 2018 elections. So this project was sort of conceived and thought of amid concerns that biometric ID would be topical again ahead of upcoming elections next year in 2022. However, by the time we started research, it was March 2020, and the research obviously evolved considerably given both the economic crisis and the COVID-19 pandemic. And our focus really broadened beyond just elections to include social assistance and ID systems more broadly. And it's also worth noting that who we were able to interview which was, the real substance and foundation of our research, was also quite likely impacted by the pandemic. The interviews which we conducted between March and October of 2020. The report was released in January of this year, so 2021. And we spoke with quite a few private security companies, as well as NGOs and the World Bank. Obviously, though, a lot has happened in Lebanon since January this year when the report was published. And even as we were finalizing the report, news of the ESSN and the World Bank's $246 million loan to Lebanon to provide cash transfers and access to social services to vulnerable Lebanese populations affected by the economic and COVID-19 crises. That was just happening and just going through as we were finalizing the report. So I also just want to take a moment to acknowledge as well my own positionality in this research before getting into it. So I'm half British, half Lebanese. At the time of research, I was based in Tripoli in North Lebanon. But I have been living in Amman since March of this year. And so there is definitely, I just sort of want to take a moment to acknowledge that a lot has happened since the report was finalized and since this research was conducted. But today, so I'm going to be diving into two of the findings, which were personally the most fascinating for me. So I want to talk about data fragmentation and then also data responsibility and this more sort of the international dynamics that were really present in Lebanon when looking at biometric ID, but that can also be seen in other examples across the region and globally. So first, looking at data fragmentation. And so one argument which is often made for biometric and digital ID by its advocates is this idea of efficiency, right? So that, you can collect data only once and that this can be used across multiple agencies and ministries, that biometric and digital ID is more efficient for end users or for citizens, because then they'll have this one ID for everything, and so that it will minimize bureaucracy. Critics of digital ID, though, generally note that centralization actually often means storing large quantities of really sensitive personal data on a central database, which creates greater privacy risks. Centralization means that sensitive data can be shared between third parties. So, for instance, there might be a centralized database that's shared by multiple ministries. For instance, if it's a government-issued ID and like a government national registry. But that this can also mean that it's more readily used for surveillance and tracking of citizens. So Access Now's Why ID campaign, for instance, and I'm quoting here, says that most digital identity programs follow a centralized and ubiquitous model without delivering incremental benefits to users. The central digital identity is linked to multiple other IDs and purposes for each user. This framework provides an ability to track and log everyday activities and transactions of a user. So we sort of, in sort of the broader global analysis of digital and biometric ID, there's this issue of centralization and of this centralized database, the centralized registry, as being as sort of increasing efficiency is the argument by proponents, and then I'm sure most of our colleagues at this conference would sort of take a similar position to Access Now, where noting that this centralization actually creates a lot of risk and potential for harm. One thing that was incredibly interesting from our research in Lebanon, and that we noted, was that at least at the time of this research back in 2020, this concern of centralization didn't actually hold true due to Lebanon's political landscape. So centralization and this idea of a central database would require cooperation across different ministries, which just seems incredibly unlikely in the fractured political system that we have. in a presentation in 2017, a representative from the Administrative Reform Ministry, OMSA, highlighted the challenges they face in 20 years, including resistance to change, a refusal to share information, and incompatible systems and processes. But it's also worth noting that this this fragmentation of data isn't a good thing. So following the August 4th Beirut port explosion, an assessment by Siren Analytics found that different ministries had contradicting numbers for the number of families in need of aid. And in some cases, each ministry was using outdated data. And so the report highlighted bias, a lack of impartiality, and data privacy concerns in assessment and distribution. It is worth noting that Siren Analytics had partnered with a government oversight body, the Central Inspection, to launch Impact, the interministerial platform for assessment, coordination, and tracking. So they have and this collects data from local ministries and municipalities to streamline service delivery. So they do have this vested interest in promoting impact, but the concerns the report flagged, I've still included them here because they are quite noteworthy. Decentralization of registry databases in Lebanon then also facilitates this lack of oversight, which can lead to security vulnerabilities, endangering individuals' privacy. So from what we understand, and what we understood in the research, the ministry or security agency that's collecting sensitive personal data stores it themselves. So this was something that we heard from the security companies and the private sector actors who are providing tools and services to the different ministries and security agencies. But without clear legal and technical frameworks in place in Lebanon, that data may be shared, leaked, and is vulnerable to cybersecurity attacks and surveillance. So we've seen instances of this already happen in Lebanon several times. So thinking about, so for instance, a representative speaking at AUB from one of the security agencies mentioned that there have been 80 to 90 cyber attacks. We've seen data just sort of across the board, a lack of understanding and knowledge about data sharing and sort of responsible data practices within the government. I'm now going to move on to my second point, which is around data responsibility and the international connections and sort of the international linkages of data infrastructure. And so one of the big questions we had with our research was trying to understand a bit more about the private sector actors. So who is providing the technology and systems behind biometric and digital ID? Lebanon, in some cases, is actually exceptional in this, in some ways, because many of the infrastructures are actually supported and developed by a company that is Lebanese called Encrypt. However, often biometric and digital ID systems and technologies are provided by companies based in Europe or the US, and yet many of the clients are actually global South countries. A really great example of this is digital ID systems for use in elections. So you often have there are often these power dynamics that are present. So if we're thinking about these like large multinational companies, and there's just this sort of slight colonial overtone in a way, which is, I think, a dynamic that we, particularly in Lebanon and in the context of aid and the massive amounts of funding that is flowing into Lebanon, around aid is something we really need to keep in mind. So that was also a second question we were interested in, which is, sort of where is the funding for these, for biometric ID and digital ID technologies coming from? Because they are expensive. So overhauling ID cards in Lebanon was estimated by the director of civil status as being 20 to 25 million USD. And this was a few years ago, that figure's from. A Saudi grant is credited for funding the biometric passports, which is, the number is a bit disputed, but one estimate is 35 million US dollars. And then since 2010, 2011, given Lebanon's position and the conflict with Syria, within Syria, sorry, we're seeing border management support from countries like the US, the UK, China, France, Germany, Italy, Poland, Qatar, Russia, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. So they are supporting Lebanon's different security agencies, basically. And it's hard to know exact numbers, but it's not too, we definitely suspect that much of this actually goes towards biometric and digital ID systems. So, for instance, in 2017, the US supported Lebanon's internal security forces, ISF, with an 11 million US dollar upgrade to its IT system and biometrics database. Another sort of key issue I want to raise within this sort of theme of data responsibility is just around like who are technology companies accountable to. So one thing when we spoke to the private sector companies who were providing these technologies to government ministries is that the contracts that they're signing is very much with the government ministry. So they don't have any legal accountability to the actual end user of an ID system, so the ID holder. Instead, their legal accountability is to their client, which is, in many of these cases, with like a national ID system, it's the government. And companies we spoke with were clear that they provided the technology and the tools, but that the contracting government or humanitarian actor that they were working with bore responsibility for the data. Their position was really one of sort of absolving themselves of their responsibility to the end user, whether that's like citizen or refugee or resident or whoever is that ID holder. Their risk assessment was also something that seemed quite limited, and this wasn't something that we researched in depth, but it's definitely an avenue for further exploration. And for instance, one representative from IrisGuard, which is a Jordanian British company that provides iris scanning technology for refugee biometric identification in the region, claimed that there were no risks to their technology because no risks related, sorry, the direct quote is, there's no risks related to the operation in Lebanon since there is no data stored inside the country at all, and the UNHCR systems are managed and maintained by UNHCR outside the region, eliminating the possibility for data breaches and abuse. So I'm going to stop there, but and I think that's a great point for Jena to take over. She'll be talking more about these data collection infrastructures.
Awesome. Thank you, Sacha, for such an incredible presentation, and your report continues to be absolutely fundamental to my research. So it's really great to hear you speaking about it, and we certainly have lots to chat about in the discussion. Just a little precursor, my internet might be having some issues today, so I apologize in advance if I drop out, but I'll do what I can. So today what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about my research on contestations to and gaps in data collection, which includes biometric enrollment as a form of data. And I'm going to be speaking about them in the context of social assistance delivery. So a major issue with this move towards digitized welfare solutions is that these technologies really depend on quality and reliable data sets, which are always inherently incomplete. And I'm just going to set my timer so I don't go above time. So, of course, gaps in social assistance data are not unique to Lebanon, but they do pose a particular challenge in this specific context. So Leila Rafai argues in her assessment of the use of open data to respond to the Syrian crisis that refugee data are difficult to collect and they're often incomplete. Data are usually collected from official registrations, and so unregistered refugees may not be counted. In another way, numbers have to be estimated using modeling techniques that have oftentimes been proven to be exclusionary. And on top of this, asylum seekers and internally displaced people are a category that are not included in official data, such as UNHCR's data. And so in my research, it became very apparent from the diverse range of actors who I spoke to, from NGOs to UN agencies to charities, community groups, political commentators, journalists. There's often this unspoken assumption that the data sets are there or that any challenges can easily be overcome without excluding too many people. But what my research and also what Sacha's reveals is that in Lebanon, it's particularly difficult to acquire reliable data sets on impoverished populations, many of whom rely on social assistance like cash cards or food vouchers. So I'm going to go through a few reasons that complement what Sacha already discussed on how data collection infrastructures in Lebanon have proven to be unstable or deficient. And then these consequently reinforce many human and digital rights issues. So refugees are obviously required to submit biometric data, such as fingerprints and having their photos taken. And this information also has to be updated at UNHCR WFP validation centers. And they're supposed to validate this roughly every 3 months, but COVID has obviously paused a lot of this. However, many Syrian refugees who I spoke to, as well as those represented in reports, are quite hesitant to give their personal information, especially their biometric data, given concerns that population registries can be shared with Lebanese or Syrian governments to facilitate the repatriation. Many have outwardly said in reports that they would rather go without any aid than submitting this data. And this is compounded by the fact that many donor nations have been very open with the fact that they don't actually trust the Lebanese government with sensitive information. And this mistrust is really important because it actually has implications for who gets access to aid and who refugee data is shared with and how it is stored. And Syrian beneficiaries' concerns about divulging their data are in many ways warranted and confirmed by observers such as Privacy International. So the Lebanese government has demonstrated an eagerness in terms of obtaining volumes of information on Syrian refugees, which include their biometric data. And so, for instance, in 2014, they asserted that they have a legal right to access such information. And although the UNHCR has claimed that they do not share this information with the Lebanese state, one could understand why there are doubts on the ground about the UNHCR's claims regarding information shared and how it can be used. More recently, in my research, what we also see is that the government has actually tried to access information and lists on refugee beneficiaries who received aid in response to the Beirut port explosion. So even though that was taking place in 2014, we're actually seeing this taking place as well in the contemporary moment. And obviously the agencies I spoke to did not share this sensitive information, but it does again support refugees' fears about their digital rights. So collectively, these points highlight important challenges to data security and data privacy for those reliant on aid in response to crises. And we also see this prominent right, so the right to be forgotten. So you should have this right to not divulge your information, or you can request to have it retracted. But because you must register your information in order to get aid, this right to be forgotten is simply not afforded to refugee beneficiaries. And what we also see with this example here is we see complexities about data sovereignty, given that data is, yes, technically extracted on Lebanese land, but it's also being held by transnational organizations such as the UNHCR, who do not divulge or share this information. So another point that I want to discuss is that in order to get social assistance, you need to re-verify your information roughly every 3 to 4 months. And this is, of course, very important for data reliability because a good database is one that's kept up to date, one that is not reliant on data from years ago. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, COVID has really posed a huge challenge to this with the lockdowns and restrictions on mobility and travel. But well before COVID, aid agencies were actually having issues reaching refugees in remote areas to collect information. And again, this isn't specific to Lebanon, but we do see this happening in this context. So in Lebanon, there are only so many verification centers around the country, and those in remote areas such as the Bekaa might not have phone service or the ability to afford a phone because they're impoverished. And therefore, they won't have the ability to know where and when to provide this crucial information to get welfare. They also might not be able to take the time off work or have enough money to transport themselves. And then this maps onto the existing crises in the nation, such as the higher fuel prices and therefore the higher prices of public transportation. So these pose immense challenges to re-verifying your information in order to get social assistance. And with this, we therefore see inevitable gaps in data collection for social assistance. So now kind of switching from refugees, I want to talk a little bit about Lebanese residents and migrants that are in the nation. So Lebanon hasn't had a proper census since roughly the 1930s. And so even impoverished Lebanese are left out of these crumbling and under-regulated data collection infrastructures. And what my research found really interesting is that Lebanese and migrant residents are disproportionately affected in ways because Syrian refugees in some ways benefit from existing well-established data collection platforms such as the Refugee Assistance Information System. And so I have a quote here up on the slide, and I hope that you can all see it, and my apologies if you can't, but it's one of my participants speaking about how, it's really interesting how we're talking about these challenges to data collection with refugees when really refugees actually already have platforms that have been used for a long time. They're well established, they're well funded. The Lebanese residents and migrants simply don't have such a system, and therefore there are immense gaps in their data. And because now we know that the rising multidimensional poverty levels in the country are so high that a vast majority of Lebanese nationals are now requiring social assistance, this poses a lot of challenges. So another interesting point that my research found is that INGOs operating their own digital platforms to coordinate and disperse aid are now challenged by the fuel and electricity crisis. So one individual I spoke to who coordinates a digital platform that provides aid to beneficiaries and also coordinates the different partners that provide social assistance. They were trying to grapple with these challenges with the fuel and electricity crises taking place in the nation. And what they said is this poses tons of challenges. So what they said is it's really challenging. Even if we say we have our own electricity generators, now you have a fuel shortage that will run the generators. So basically it's become a vicious cycle in Lebanon, and it's become an infrastructural issue. So they thought it was the best option to have the service abroad. So for instance, leaving their servers in the US in case of emergencies. So if the electricity and gas crisis really did shut down all of a sudden, they didn't have that backup option. So they're having to place the servers out of the nation, and now they're operating transnationally just so that they can operate the donor section and channel the funds to Lebanon from abroad. So this is obviously a crucial creative strategy or adaptation on their part. And although it's obviously necessary, it does add extra work to humanitarians' already very full plates. So it does also take time and resources away from the populations in need, given the additional costs that are required to adapt to these challenges that are not directly related to delivering social assistance at hand. And what we also see here is this raises questions about data sovereignty and jurisdiction. So for instance, who now owns this data that's stored out of state? What are the additional costs of relocating the server abroad? What are the additional challenges to adapting in this way and having to coordinate with transnational partners just so they can operate the electricity and data servers? And does this, at the end of the day, impact the autonomy of social assistance organizations? So another major gap in data collection that we're seeing is that in 2015, Lebanon had required the UNHCR to stop registering Syrian refugees. However, we obviously know that this did not stop the mass exodus of men, women, and children fleeing into the country. And for these reasons, there are many who to this day remain in the nation unregistered. However, as I've mentioned earlier, registration is absolutely essential in order to be eligible for social assistance. So in light of prohibiting the registration, the UNHCR and other NGOs and INGOs who I spoke to adapted in many ways. And so one way that they did this was setting up their own identity registration and verification infrastructures that were completely separate from the state and were kind of used in weird ways as loopholes. So when I asked one participant how identity registration figured in their work, they said something that they did in response to this 2015 prohibition was that they issued barcodes, and this system was called Enrolled for Assistance, or EFA. And so the quote is up there on the slide, and I'll read just bits and pieces of it. And so they said, what this meant practically was that the UNHCR was still getting information on families that arrived in Lebanon post-2015, but they weren't technically being registered. So it was a loophole in that you didn't have to get too messy with the government. And it means that if you arrived before 2015 as a Syrian refugee, you have an actual registration certificate, like a piece of A4 paper, and this has all of your information on it. But if you arrive post-2015, you're still acknowledged by the UNHCR as a refugee, but you can't get this official certificate because you weren't allowed to register officially. And so you have something that was literally what they called a barcode. And so this barcode was used to refer to families that arrived post-2015. And so it did allow them to make up for these deficiencies in data collection infrastructures, but again, it posed so many challenges that they're having to overcome. So all in all, with these examples, there are many challenges with data collection, which is so interesting given that the datafication of aid in Lebanon and around the world is just growing and growing. So agencies are increasingly trying to move away from in-kind provision because they're wanting to use data and digital technologies. But as we've pointed out, there are so many issues with doing this. And so this poses tons of issues to, for example, social assistance eligibility assessments, coordination, and the delivery beneficiaries when we have gaps in these data collection infrastructures. So an issue with this, for instance, is that without sufficient data collection infrastructures, you can't actually do real-time collection and data analysis. And this is absolutely fundamental in crisis contexts where you must evaluate, report, and act immediately. This isn't just long-term welfare such as unemployment. This is them reacting immediately at this moment in time. They essentially need to be able to collect real-time information, but that's thwarted by the fact that the data is not reliable. And then in another way, and this is something my research is still trying to unpack, is that the UN and INGO databases, in a way, are ingraining dependency of the Lebanese state on these transnational agencies because they're not actually trying to build up the nation's own capacity to effectively collect data, store it, and analyze it on its own. Instead, they're doing that all on their own, completely separate from the state, not actually supporting them to have this long-term data collection infrastructure. So basically, I think it's really important to back up, and maybe we should first be focusing on data collection infrastructures before we implement database decision-making in welfare more broadly. So with that, I will turn it over to Sacha.
Thanks, Jena. Just trying to find the unmute button, the story of 2020 and 2021. So thank you so much for that, Jena. One thing I love is how you really sort of went into the detail of how data is actually being collected in your research. And with this sort of focus on these data-fired solutions, one thing one thing that we're seeing, or one thing that we've noticed, is this sort of focus on immediate needs and like humanitarian needs instead of digital rights. So as like humanitarian needs are in some ways put ahead of digital rights, and digital rights are rendered secondary. So and this is something I think we've both seen in our research, and particularly as the situation has just like deteriorated in Lebanon over the past couple of years. So this is one point I think we both wanted to make in this talk today, is that, you know, we understand that there are so many like overlapping and sustained crises both in Lebanon and the region more widely, that it can be easy to lose sight of the salience of digital rights. So by immediate needs, I'm really talking about water, food, shelter, protection. And so index digital rights are often framed as secondary to these other like rights, which you know, right for life-sustaining aid, essentially, and social assistance. But we would argue that digital rights are not actually secondary. So they're fundamentally twined with these more immediate material and essential rights. And I think both our research speaks to this, is that this is especially true. So given that many technologies and forms of data, so whether that's econometric targeting, biometric ID and verification, or big data sets, increasingly mediate the access to these more immediate material and essential rights. So there's this question of who is getting excluded, and that may be manual workers, it may be people who don't have another form of ID to verify that, it may be trans persons. And there is just this ample evidence of poor data protection, handling, and technological malfunctioning in Lebanon as well. So I think Jena can speak to this better than I about like harassment at ATMs and not being selected for aid. And also from other contexts like ADR in India, not catering to elderly and remote populations, that's literally impacting a person's life in the form of death, of denial of essential goods, healthcare, deportation, etc. So with this talk and with that panel, one thing we really just wanted to stress is that we, you know, we really wanted to be putting digital rights within sort of biometric ID and aid and these kind of larger structures and infrastructures back on the agenda, and just say that you know, digital rights are inextricably intertwined with these more immediate and material needs, as they are often that, and then increasingly becoming that kind of main tool or barrier mediating access to essential goods and services. Jena, do you want to talk more on that point?
Yeah. I just I think that's something that you did a great job of bringing that all together, and I think that's something that both of our research, even though it has tons of parallels, it is obviously distinct, and that is something where it obviously converges. And yeah, so I'm just going to provide maybe an example of the way in which digital rights, it would be almost impossible to assume that they're secondary. So we know that in social assistance and humanitarian contexts, because you have such large populations, they're now using algorithms and targeting formulas to figure out who's the most vulnerable, so they can target aid to the most vulnerable as a way to sort of cost effectively get aid and more timely get aid to the right people at the right time. But the issue with this, there's tons of issues with these targeting algorithms. So many of the beneficiaries are not actually understanding how the algorithm works. And so when they're rejected from the algorithm, they're not getting access to essential goods and services such as food and shelter. And because of the lack of transparency with these types of algorithms, and they've said outward, like to the public, we don't want to provide this information for a fear that these algorithms can be used for fraudulently, or that they can sort of co-opt the system by knowing what the variables are and then answering those variables in order to be assessed as vulnerable. So basically, they're not being transparent, which is also another major right that we need to be discussing in these digital spaces. If you're going to be using something as opaque as an algorithm to deliver absolutely essential goods and services, we should try to be as transparent as possible about it, but that's not the case. And so then when refugees are going to the community organizations who teach them how to register, they are being essentially, it's being explained in ways that they're not understanding. Even myself, as someone who studies science and technology, algorithms are incredibly complex. Even I cannot unpack them, let alone a refugee who's already had so many challenges with access to education or literacy, perhaps. And so then they're trying to implement these things such as the grievance redress mechanism, but there's been reports that they're getting inconsistent information about the algorithm at call centers, or they feel that they're not getting meaningful information. Or on top of that, what they don't realize is you actually need this requisite technology in order to even contest the algorithm. So contestability is another major digital right. So you should always have the right to contest an automated decision about yourself or a platform that's malfunctioning. But if you don't even have the requisite technology to contest this and say, hey, you misassessed me, or hey, can you call this out? That therefore translates into a lack of food or water or shelter, that you can't change those circumstances. On top of that, in my research, we're seeing the overlapping with security. So you get, let's say, a body scan or biometrically surveyed, or you have to go through an interview or something like that. And you're providing all this digital information, all this data, or you're interacting with these digital technologies, but based off of a certain assessment or triangulation of various forms of data, you are therefore not allowed to cross a border, or you are detained at a border, or you can actually be imprisoned. And that has real repercussions for physical, emotional, mental health. So again, we do see these overlappings of digital and what I would say tangible, fundamental human rights, like what we would more typically consider of as rights. And something that Sacha and I discuss is, of course, it's so difficult to be saying like, hey, data first and digital technology first, when in Lebanon you have people, not just refugees, but like the vast majority of the population who are now suffering because so many people are in poverty. And so it's kind of hard to say, hey, we should be thinking about digital rights when you can't even access food and electricity. And so we recognize those complexities. And for individuals who research digital rights, we find this a really challenging space at this particular time in Lebanon, because of course you can't be saying that digital rights should be coming first, but we also cannot deny that they overlap and interface with and completely impact access to these fundamental rights. So we're having a little bit of struggle trying to frame this in ways that are still salient, but recognize that it's not black and white. It would be much different for instance, I'm in Australia, to make that claim. People are there's less degree of the population who are struggling for access to essential goods and services like food.
Thank you, Jena. Thanks so much for raising that. I feel like that rationale of fraud is so often given, and it was sort of the main reason given for the use of biometric ID in elections, but it's also, that sort of main reason given to justify biometric ID in humanitarian settings and contexts. And yet, when you begin to unpack it, it's more the fear. There is actual very little evidence that these technologies prevent fraud in any way. And then it's interesting as well what you mentioned about like the algorithmic tool to like the algorithms assessing vulnerability. So often like that's already a really quite untransparent process. And then this algorithm, you know, people often have questions of why was this person selected and not me? And then the algorithm just seems to be almost this additional layer or just adding this additional layer of that like lack of transparency in there too. So it's something that was already happening without like AI, without this technology, but now it's kind of the technology is sort of supporting these already like untransparent practices, basically.
Absolutely.
I was just wondering if anyone has any questions. We would love to take them from you. In the meantime, we can definitely keep talking about this pretty much forever. But we would love to hear your questions. Rima, I know in the chat you mentioned about Iris Guard. We can talk a bit more about that as well if you're interested. About for instance, children and biometrics, which is a whole other area. Otherwise, we can wrap up. So let me know. Okay. Cool. So yeah, we can talk a bit more about that. So one thing I can definitely mention 2 points here. So it's really interesting that you mentioned, Rima, in your comment in the chat that you know, so many refugees are actually under the age of 18, and that UNHCR is reported to scan children over the age of 3. One thing I found quite interesting is that the debate, and just to kind of add some nuance and complexify this a bit, the one thing I've really witnessed, so a lot of my work is actually in the humanitarian sector and with NGOs. And one thing I've noticed within that is the debate between different actors and between different agencies. So between UNHCR and WFP and UNICEF, for instance. And yeah, just to kind of say that it's definitely not a cohesive, and it really does vary from agency to agency and individual to individual within those. And you know, there is different guidance being issued by those different agencies, which I think presents an opportunity for us as digital rights advocates to you know, have a voice in a way within those, and to share our thoughts and our research in helping them come up with this policy around, you know, biometric ID and other technologies. So that's kind of the way I look at it. The other thing I just wanted to mention is that in the sort of wider landscape scanning research around biometric and digital ID and elections, one case that came up was the case of Yemen. And this really shocked me when I dug into different documents. So in Yemen just offered this like fascinating example of multinational aid funding international companies to implement this multi-million-dollar biometric ID system for elections, which just had these really dubious privacy standards, and was actually tested on children. So, and these documents existed scattered across the internet, and I was just absolutely blown away. So they, in 2014, ahead of the 2014 election, which was funded by Sweden, Saudi Arabia, the US, UK, Denmark, Japan, Turkey, and the EU, and supported by UNDP and the International Foundation for Electoral Systems, Yemen was planning to launch this biometric voter registry. And so different companies from Belgium, from France, and the Netherlands were invited to showcase their technologies. And in a UNDP report, it it was sharing, with no sense of critique, that these systems have been tested, and the tests were carried out at 2 elementary schools in Sana'a, where more than 100 boys and 100 girls participated in the mock exercises in order to test the equipment in a real-life setting. And this just totally blew my mind because, first of all, these are not the end users for your biometric ID system. Elementary school children presumably cannot vote. And then the fact that they were testing them on children was just mind-blowing. And then the other issue, it didn't mention as well, like what actually happened to this data after it was collected. These companies were collecting biometric data from more than 200 kids. It didn't mention anything about informed consent, about what happened to their data after this test. And yeah, it was just kind of absolutely shocking. And just very kind of murky and unclear. Yeah, I'm gonna stop there. That was just an example.
Really interesting point, Sacha. And you mentioned the no consent there, and a lot of the digital rights literature, especially recently with work coming out on Facebook's algorithmic targeting and profiling of children. There's a lot of discussion now about, like, can children even consent? And I think we could debate that for hours. But obviously, I think something that your example really points to is that these agencies are really employing this, trialing this on very docile and vulnerable populations, specifically within the global south. And we obviously would not see these dynamics taking place oftentimes in the global north. And I think something that your example really points to is that we really see these types of digital technologies and data collection being experimented and trialed out in these vulnerable areas. And they're often in crisis and conflict afflicted areas, especially those that are often seen by those in the West or in Europe as perhaps non-democratic, as illegitimate, as requiring, like, this paternalistic, they require our help, so therefore we have the right to be trialing out this type of data before we then therefore move it to our more democratic and legitimate populations. And I think that's something that's really problematic to really think about. And it really points to how digital rights have this huge, or a lack of digital rights, have this major overlapping with the colonization of technology, or technology is having a colonizing effect. And a lot of literature in the science and technology space is really getting at that and has long really gotten at that. And it's something I think we could be discussing more as a community.
Thanks, Jena. Yeah, I just see that Rima has shared a question, and the question is, what are your recommendations to digital rights organizations in the region interested in litigation against the violations of the international agencies' privacy and data protection violations against refugees and those in conflict crisis areas? Great question. I sort of wish I knew more about this because I'm not a lawyer, and I feel like I can't offer any litigation advice. But I guess I can maybe provide some perspective on this as a sort of insider-outsider, in that I kind of feel like I have a foot in both communities in a way. Well, I like to think I do, but digital rights communities, and then also the humanitarian sector. And I think my perspective is that, like, often when we are doing research and there's that kind of advocacy piece, it's very easy to see these organizations as like this cohesive whole, when actually there are lots of different opinions, capacity, knowledge within them, and they are kind of made up of people, right? So my perspective is, or what I've found, is that there are actually many allies within these organizations. It's just kind of finding them and bringing them out, and kind of, I personally would love to see more bridges being built between digital rights organizations in the region and these international agencies, and particularly as many of them have, especially like the really large ones, like they are sort of talking to these global technology companies, and they do have partnerships to organizations like Twilio or Facebook, or, you know, and just because of their scale and breadth, they can actually potentially have some kind of impact. So I would love to see advocacy strategies that kind of tap into these organizations, and especially in the region where we have such a large population of refugees, and like aid is just such a huge industry here. Jena?
Yeah, I was actually just going to pop a resource in the chat. So one of my colleagues, I think she's at the University of Oslo, is actually doing work on digital lawyering in the Middle East. So I will find it, but at this point in time, I can't. I'll put it in the chat eventually. So something that I'm really thinking about in the space, and Rima, what a great question, is maybe the efficacy of coalition building. Like, coalition building has been around a long time, and sometimes I think we have this knee-jerk reaction to kind of reinvent the wheel and like do these really exceptional things. But I think coalition building has been something that has worked for a really long time. Obviously, it has its challenges, its costs, its emotional, physical, financial labor. But because we're already seeing around the globe these small little bits of coalition building taking place around those exact issues that you brought up, Rima, I could see that really having at least some impact, perhaps, in this type of space. And I think it's India. This is taking place a lot right now, not around refugees, but around impoverished populations, around the Aadhaar system. And activists are getting incredibly vocal with local groups and individuals. So perhaps there's also maybe a little bit of not case law, but like learning from their case, and what can we take from that, and how can we use it in this particular context. And cool. It looks like we're just about out of time.
We are indeed. I don't know if we have a minute to do a quick wrap up of some of our kind of trajectories. So yeah, maybe we can wrap up really quickly. Perhaps we each take a point, Jena. So just to kind of look to the future and map some of the trajectories that we hope our research kind of points to, and to summarize what we've been chatting about. So one prediction that we have, and one thing we noticed, is that data centralization is unlikely to happen in Lebanon due to this kind of divisiveness and fragmentation in the government, but that isn't necessarily a protection.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think another major point is that given the complexities and the pre-existing deficiencies in Lebanon, we do expect that data collection, the infrastructures, and biometric enrollment will become ever more transnational and out of state. So that unfortunately does hollow out the state and impede a bit of sovereignty. But again, as we mentioned, this is an incredibly complex situation in which you have to do what you have to do. But perhaps in the future, what we see with the ESSN is them doing a little bit more of capacity building, and maybe that will overlap with data collection infrastructures. And then at the end of the day, I think what we really do just want to hone in on is the fact that digital rights really can't be thought of as secondary or tertiary. They absolutely impact, are fundamental to these first primary human rights that are tangible and physical.
Well, that about wraps it up. And thank you so much for joining us today. Please feel free to reach out to us about any of the issues we talked about. And thank you. Bye.
Thank you so much.
Bye.